We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Hello everyone, it's amazing to have today Chris Uhlmann, who's an esteemed journalist, one of the leading journalists across Australia. Chris, thank you for joining today.
Good to be with you, Sunil.
I mean, let's go straight into it. You know, I've seen clips of your one of your more recent documentaries where you talk about the real cost of net zero. There's some really worrying stories in there about pensioners who are having to pay extremely high energy prices. First of all, what made you do this documentary? How did it all come about?
Well, I wanted to start from the basics, and that is that no one actually understands where their power comes from. I think that, and we're seeing it across the Western world, particularly in cities, that people are so disconnected from their sources of energy, their sources of wealth, and their sources of food, that they're actually voting against them. You know, it's as if electricity generates itself. You know, we switch a light switch, we don't think about where it comes from. It's like your teeth, really. You know, you never think about your teeth until something goes wrong, and then when something does go wrong, there's nothing that you can think about apart from that. So I wanted to break it right down to the very basics as to how our energy is produced, how an electricity system works, particularly a bulk electricity system, and the necessity of how you keep that working. And it is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. What we're doing now and what we do every single day, when we have an electricity system, you have to perfectly balance the supply with the demand. Exactly. And if you don't, then the frequency gets out of whack and the system could collapse within a minute. So that is an extraordinary balancing act. It's the most complicated piece of machinery in any economy. And the thing that gets me about it too is that when we hear economists talking about the economy, they seem to forget that without energy, there is no economy. It is a starting point. It's not an input. And it's not by accident that what we're seeing in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Germany, in California, is that when you start to muck around with that system and put on large-scale wind and solar, which by its nature cannot produce energy on demand, we can't dispatch it in the way that we could with coal or oil or gas or nuclear energy, then you create a certain series of problems for yourself. They are physical problems. We're talking about physics. And the people who talk a lot about energy know nothing about physics. They know nothing about how an electricity system works. They're activists who believe that the goal of our energy systems now is to cut carbon emissions. Well, if that becomes the goal, you're asking the wrong question. And when you ask the wrong question, you will get the wrong answer. And we're getting the wrong answer around all of these economies. And you see it in the UK. The price of electricity has gone through the roof. Everywhere where we have seen the large-scale deployment of wind and solar, as night follows day, we see two things. The price of electricity rises and the system becomes more unreliable. And that equation will keep going, because what we have to do in order to run this system on wind and solar is to essentially build 100% backup. And you can do that in a number of ways. If you've got a lot of hydropower, that would work, but very few countries have it. If you try and do it with batteries, they don't last long enough and they're really, really expensive. So typically what we see is a large build out of gas. So the price of electricity will depend very much on the price of gas. But unfortunately, and finally, what we've seen from the people who've been the activists about this is the same people who want lots of wind and solar have demonized all fossil fuel. So they've actually made it impossible to run the systems that they demand. You could not make a more ridiculous energy policy than the one we're seeing in Australia and the UK and in Germany.
I mean, the UK has been long down this road. You know, currently it's a Labour government. Even previously, the Conservative government, it was a real push for these net zero policies, and you could see the rising energy bills for pretty much everyone in the country, and it's been worrying. I think a lot of people have shaped it around the war, so Russia, Ukraine, saying that's the ultimate reason for why the costs of energy is so high in the UK. Has that reason been used for Australia as well? Has that had an impact, the Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah, but absolutely. But see what happened in the Russia-Ukraine war. What happened there was that the giant Ponzi scheme, which was the German electricity system, was exposed for what it was. It didn't function without Russian gas. So people talk about Angela Merkel, and there's, in Germany, I think there's still a residual sentimental attraction to her. I can't see how anyone can get defense policy wrong, foreign policy wrong, and energy policy wrong and still have any credibility at all, because that's precisely what Angela Merkel delivered to the people of Germany. And once the Russian gas was cut off, their system simply didn't function. So what happened then was that they had to scramble around the world to try and find gas wherever they could. And that scramble by Europe, and the UK was part of that too, drove up the prices everywhere else, because there's only so much gas that's on the sea at any moment. And you're now getting liquefied natural gas imports. And so here's the ridiculous thing in Europe, right? Now, I don't know the geology of Europe, but I'm assuming that wherever you've got a coal seam, and you've got it in Germany, they burn lignite there, that you would have gas with that. And if you went to explore that you could get coal seam gas. But of course, the continent's absolutely opposed to sourcing its own energy. So it's made itself energy dependent. It's going to use gas. It's just not going to use its own gas. It's going to import gas. And the same thing's happening in the United Kingdom. And there the system is even worse. And I don't pretend to be an expert there, but I noticed that with great fanfare last year, you pronounced the fact that you were getting rid of your last coal-fired power plant. You have. But you still burn wood pellets. In fact, 10% of your energy comes from burning wood. Now think about that. Coal is much more energy dense than wood. Wood still produces carbon emissions. But the ridiculous accounting that we have in the green economy is that because trees, when they grow, suck up a certain amount of carbon, you actually account for that as being a net zero emission system when you burn it, even though you're releasing carbon emissions into the atmosphere. You're now still burning wood. You're releasing carbon emissions, and you're pretending that that's having no effect. I mean, again, a group of 6-year-olds with crayons would struggle to come up with a more senseless energy policy than that which we're seeing in the UK, in Germany, in California, and in Australia.
So why do you think these groups, why do you think these countries, these politicians have made these decisions when it comes to energy? Because it is pretty clear from what you're saying, and I think most people who've done any sort of reading can see this doesn't make sense. Why do you think they've gone down this road, both in Australia and in UK specifically?
Well, because for the last 25 years, or let's go back to the Rio Earth Summit, which was 1992, 1993, the world started to get concerned about carbon emissions and the fact that the more carbon there was in the atmosphere, or the more greenhouse gases, because it's not just carbon, of course. In fact, water vapour is a greenhouse gas. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the Earth would be an iceberg. So you need a certain amount of carbon, but we've decided that it's too much carbon, and it's anthropomorphic emissions, which is by humanity, which is driving the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the planet is heating as a result of that. And I think there is plenty of science that would say that that is absolutely the case. But it depends on how big a problem you see that is. Is it an existential threat? Well, the world is treating it as though it is an existential threat that much must be solved within the next few years. So we're moving remarkably rapidly to try and make change to an energy system which grew up over 120 years to, by 2050, get to net zero. You know, and when you see where the world's come from since 1992, around about 85% of primary energy. Now, that's not just the electricity system. That's all the stuff that you see around us. And this is the thing, Sunil, that people don't get, that fossil fuel is buried deep inside of everything that you can see in the built environment. So the fundamentals of our society, so how we make concrete, how we make steel, how we make plastic, how we make ammonia, and ammonia feeds half the world's population because of the way we make fertilizer. So without those things, the world doesn't function. And in 1992, 85% of the world's primary energy came from fossil fuel. That's the way we make things. Now we've got that down to 80% over the course of more than a quarter of a century. And we are expecting to get to net zero by 2050. I mean, this is actually an absurdity. No country will meet that mark without some very creative accounting. But that's the reason that's pushing all of this. And we're seeing it playing out mostly in the electricity system. But the electricity system is only 20% of the problem. Once we've solved that problem, we have to solve the other 80%, which is how do we make concrete, steel, plastic, and ammonia? And at this stage, we don't have the technologies that enable us to do that without using fossil fuel. So in fact, the thing that gets me about this stuff is I think we should start insisting with the people who are demanding that this happen, that they have fossil-free Fridays, that every Friday they do not touch, do not consume, do not work with anything that comes from fossil fuel. And guess what? You'll have to leave your house and go and stand on the grass as long as it's not been fertilised by something with ammonia, and be naked because a lot of your clothes are going to come from there as well. There is nothing that we have in the environment in which we live now which doesn't owe itself in some way to fossil fuel. And that includes, by the way, more than 90% of the medicines that we have are hydrocarbon based. But what is the alternative for that?
What I find fascinating from, again, from everything you're saying is in Australia and similar to the UK, how this seems to have been almost hijacked by both political sides, so both the right and left. And, I've quite a while ago, I actually had the opportunity to speak to Malcolm Turnbull. We did a similar sort of podcast. He essentially said anyone that didn't kind of agree on his line of thinking in terms of the importance of green energy was essentially, on the far right of things of his political party. Why is it that both the liberals in Australia and the more the nationals, the conservative element of Australia have almost had this universal kind of belief that this is the way to go forward, that this is to push net zero is the only option? Why have both kind of come up with this sort of plan?
Well, it's become a quasi-religion, Sunil, and I think that people quite rightly want to look after the planet. But what we've seen around the Western world is a complete collapse in belief in the Christian God, which essentially was the foundation of a Judeo-Christian ethic, was the foundation of our societies. And that's a project that's been running for more than 100 years. It was a very long, slow project to get us to the point where a loss of faith in God became pretty much, the thing in most Western societies. Australia now is essentially no longer a Christian society. It's a post-Christian society, as is the UK. The United States probably was the last great Christian nation, but it's seeing the same thing happening as well. There's a God-shaped hole inside people that they want to fill, and people want to do the right thing. And I fear that's been what's happened is that the environmental movement has taken that part. But this is the one thing that I would say about it. It has all of the elements of religion. I spent 3.5 years in a Catholic seminary, so I'm pretty used to the idea of a way a religion is constructed. It is, you have sinned against the planet. You will be punished. You must repent. It goes even down to food prohibitions, like in Catholic Church, you wouldn't eat meat on Friday. Well, you're not going to eat meat any day of the week if these people have their way. So it has all the prescriptions of a religion without the one essential that made Christianity and Hinduism and other great religions what they are: hope. It has all the Old Testament and none of the New Testament involved in it. There is no redemption here. And I think this is at the heart of what they're preaching at the moment, the great missing piece, which will mean that their faith founders in the long run is that they're not offering people any hope. And because of that, they run the risk that people will just give up, because the world is not going to abandon fossil fuels.
I also feel like they don't also offer the other part maybe religion offers, which is forgiveness. There doesn't seem to be any
Hmm.
forgiveness from these group of people where, I think they would see the conversation you and I are having I think I've seen them be so aggressive and so not open to the kind of conversations we're having. And I've been reading a lot in terms of recently about sorry, Karen.
No, mate, I
Yeah,
was just going to add to, you were talking to Malcolm Turnbull, who I know quite well, right? So Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister of Australia, and I was one of the press gallery journalists when he was there, and he's made it quite clear, that he's got a strong belief in all this sort of stuff. And there's a difference between believing that climate change is real and a problem, and the policies prescriptions that you decide you're going to put with it, right? What they've tried to do is to make any disagreement with running out wind and solar as a major source of energy as tantamount to being a heretic, to not believing that climate change is a problem. So it constantly keeps shifting. The ground where we are keeps shifting, and you constantly keep getting referred to as being far right when you simply say, well, look, I'd be up for it if it worked, but it doesn't work, right? So I want to see some other ideas. We're not simply going to be able to move rapidly away from fossil fuel. But this is like, again, it's like the church. There's an old saying in the Catholic Church, Roma locuta est, causa finita est, which is that Rome has spoken, the case is closed. You're not allowed to say anything that doesn't agree with the orthodoxy that comes out of Rome. The other one that always used to be the case, and I can't remember the Latin because I was a bad student, but it is, outside the church there is no salvation. And that's where you and I find ourselves now. We are outside the church, and this is one of its fundamental beliefs. So we are persona non grata, and we must be labelled like old heretics were. We must be branded, and we must be driven from polite society.
Well, I think that's an amazing analogy about it, and I think it's just really worrying that there's a lack of conversation. So, one of the things I've been reading a lot from people in the sort of Trump administration have talked about the importance of energy independence, how that's so important for coming up in terms of for peace and prosperity. Is that something that you think that with the sort of one of the bad sides of the net zero push is that lack of energy independence, that we are becoming less and less like energy independent.
Well, the UK is now completely energy dependent. It needs to get imports of gas, and it could get gas from the North Sea. It still exists there. It could look in the coal seams in the UK. I'm sure that some of it exists there because, this is where the United States is getting its power from. And again, even under the Biden administration, look, forget what governments do, what governments say. I apologise, but look at what they do. And even under the Biden administration, when they were making big gains in the cuts that they were making to their carbon emissions, and they did make big gains on that front, it was because they shifted from coal to gas. And when they got the Permian Basin going and other places like that in the United States, the United States rose under the Biden administration to becoming a larger exporter of oil than Saudi Arabia and a larger exporter of gas than Qatar. So while they were talking a great game about wind turbines and solar panels, the United States became an energy dominant player because it was extracting the resources underneath its feet. Now, in the UK, you can't do that. In Australia, we're not allowed to do that. New South Wales and Victoria essentially have placed bans on the extraction of gas. This year, we are going to build a liquefied natural gas import terminal in New South Wales. And we're going to build an import terminal in Victoria. When gas exists in New South Wales and exists in Victoria, now think about that. We've decided that we're going to use gas, that in fact that we need to use gas to support wind and solar. We're just not going to use Australian gas. And because of that, we'll pay the international price and we'll compete with you for that gas.
Absolute madness. When you put it like that, it's absolutely bizarre. And again, it's just really hard to understand why anyone would make that decision. Is Australia getting a lot of their energy from China? I think, that's something that it's often talked a lot about in the UK is the Australia-China relationship. Are China playing a big part in this?
No, so look, at this stage, we do actually have big LNG exports out of Queensland and out of Western Australia. New South Wales and Victoria, the two most populous states, have essentially made it almost impossible to extract gas. But in Queensland, they've used coal seam gas, and they're a really important player in the region. They supply China with a lot of its liquefied natural gas, and certainly Japan and Korea. So there are strategic reasons why this is really important too, because those countries, Japan and Korea, are really energy dependent on us and having those long-term contracts in place. And off the west coast of Australia, we also do it too. I mean, the big dependency that we have with China is like so much of the rest of the world, is it's our major export partner. So we export a lot of coal. We export a lot of iron ore to China. So those are the big drivers of the engine that runs Australia. And look, we don't have a very diversified economy. Like, when you look at the mix of the things that we do in Australia, the largest drivers of our economy are liquefied natural gas, coal, and iron ore. And if you look at the policies that we've actually signed up to, that eventually we're going to have to get rid of coal and liquefied natural gas in order to meet the targets that the world has set. Nothing will replace those. We're not going to become some green energy super. Every country on earth keeps talking about the fact that it's going to be a green energy superpower. Well, there'll be very few of them. Most likely it will be China. And you know how China will do that? China now burns 56% of the world's coal. Now, you'll hear a great game talked about how it's got enormous amounts of wind, it's got enormous amounts of solar. It does have. But that's not where most of its power comes from. Like all of these things, the amount of generation capacity that you have is different from the amount of actual generation, because from any solar plant, the best you're going to do is around about, in Australia, you'll get 25% out of a return on whatever you say the plated capacity is. From wind, it's going to be somewhere between 30 and 40%. By their nature, these things are off more often than they are on. So how does China become a green energy superpower? it burns an absolute ton of coal, 56% of the world's coal, and it makes solar panels with that, and it makes wind turbines with that, and it sells those things to the rest of the world. But do not fool yourself about where they come from. These things are manufactured by fossil fuel.
I think that's one of, I think, almost the great scams of what's happened in the last 20 years is this kind of feeling that if we burn less coal, cut our carbon emissions, we're doing something that's great for the planet. And I think in the UK we're very much similar to America, sold this idea that manufacturing is a massive problem, and it's one of the reasons that we burn so many carbon emissions. We don't need to manufacture as much in the UK, and we've just seen pretty much all manufacturing from the West is move across to China, and they are doing exactly what we were doing, but just they're the ones benefiting from their economy are the ones benefiting from it. So it seems really it doesn't make any sense here.
But how do we end up here, Sunil? Like, how do we end up in a circumstance where we essentially outsourced all of our manufacturing to China and made ourselves incapable of making, well, just about anything? And there is a complete link between the amount of fossil fuel a country burns and its wealth. There are no countries that are energy poor countries. What you're seeing in the UK and in Germany at the moment is the long run effect of depowering. So as you begin to use less fossil fuel, you'll find that your economy becomes less productive. You are unable to make the things that you need to be able to make. You have to import those things. There is method in the madness of Trump at the moment. Today, as I speak to you, the big thing in Australia is about the fact that Trump has whacked tariffs on some of our aluminium, or all of our aluminium and our steel exports, right? And there's a reason that he's doing this. Now, it might not work, but his intention is to make the United States a manufacturing nation again and to repatriate to the United States the manufacturing that left it. Because there is, and you'd be very well aware of this, I think an understanding across the conservative side of politics now that the liberal settlement on free trade didn't come without friction. Like, there was this idea that all boats rose when we had free trade, that everybody benefit. Well, no, actually it didn't turn out to be the case. Because if you worked in a manufacturing sector in the United States, in a blue collar job where you had a future and a decent wage, a lot of those jobs went to China, and those communities were destroyed as a result of that. So what did the US get out of free trade? Well, it got lower prices for consumers, absolutely the case. It got higher profits for a lot of companies, absolutely the case. What did it lose? It lost manufacturing jobs, and it had its society decimated in parts of the country because of that. Now, the United States now no longer thinks that that's a great deal for it, and it intends to change that. And one of the ways that Trump will change that is, yes, tariffs will actually drive up prices for consumers in the United States. But if he drills baby drills and gets more oil, more coal, more gas, drops the price of electricity, then the price of manufacturing in the United States will become very low, and the United States will become a much more competitive country on that front. Now, it might not work, but there's actually design in it. And I think the big mistake that people make, certainly in Australia and I think in the US, and in the UK, is that they think Trump's an idiot. Well, there were a lot of people who spent a lot of time doing a lot of hard thinking about what would happen when Donald Trump made his comeback. And you can see that work in Project 2025, which was done by done out of the United States. And it is a very detailed program for radical change in the United States. Now, it may or may not work, but there's a design in it.
I think it's amazing. Like for us in the UK, it's very doom and gloom. It's very negative, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. We're all pretty much under the belief that the UK is going to go for a very difficult future in the next few years. I think what's amazing in America is what you kind of said earlier, this that they have hope that maybe this will work, maybe it won't, but they have genuine hope for a plan, a project in place. And I think one of the great lies is that the manufacturing almost scam and lie that we were sold, which is, manufacturing isn't as important. We those jobs are going to become redundant sooner or later. The way technology is advancing, the culture of the sort of robot-led future, AI and all this sort of stuff. We won't need manufacturing going forward. I think that was a general assumption in the 90s and 2000s. I think what we failed to realize is that didn't happen in manufacturing. It just moved to China, and we as a country and them in States have just been worse off from it. And it's a big problem again in the UK, where there is this feeling that unless you go to university, you cannot get a job. There is a real issue in terms of there are no jobs that essentially exists for people who don't want to go to university, and I think that's a serious problem. You can really blame that on a bit on Tony Blair, who had this massive push on sending people to. I don't know if that's similar in Australia. In that case, do you have jobs outside of the sort of working professionals?
Yeah, no, so look, we've seen, and Australia, despite appearances, right, Australians like to talk themselves up as being great outdoorsy types. Since 1900, Australia's been one of the most urbanised countries on earth. Lots of reasons for that, but we clung largely to the coastline because essentially as you move further and further inland, the country becomes more arid. I mean, the great tragedy of Australia was that they imagined, like the United States, if they pushed inland, they'd find an inland sea, that there'd be riches of water there. Well, it did exist, unfortunately, just many millions of years ago. It's gone. So certainly the nature of the Australian continent meant that people tended to congregate around the cities. Now, of course, there are huge rural properties. There's a very vibrant rural community, but that's, like so many of these things, been dying over time as these rural areas become less and less prosperous. So what we've seen now is a concentration in the cities with people who are disconnected from their sources of wealth, sources of food, sources of energy. And of course, they're making the kind of decisions that you would imagine those people would make. Now, again, it's well motivated, right? People want to do the right thing. They've been sold this pup that if, put in solar panels, put up some windmills and we'll save the planet. Well, it's not going to be that simple. And this is the great lie of the whole thing, that it would be greener and that it would be cheaper. Well, it's certainly not going to be cheaper. And you can make the argument that it's not going to be greener. If you care about your landscape, we are going to bulldoze an enormous amount of Australia, literally millions and millions of hectares, to cover the place in solar panels and wind turbines because they're so they lack the energy density that you get from coal or oil or gas, which means you have to have so much more of them. You have to spread them out across a large part of the countryside. Then they all have to be connected with transmission lines. And each of those things costs money. The larger the system that you build, the more expensive it becomes. And the whole thing has to be backed up 100%, because what we've seen again in Germany, they've got a word for it. I think it's Dunkelflaute, which is the still dark. It is, you get long periods where you've got no sunshine and no wind. And if it runs for more than 3 or 4 days, there's no battery technology on Earth that can cover that. So it's that large gap that has to be paid for. And wherever you have large amounts of wind and solar, you have this enormous gap. And filling that gap will be as expensive as whatever fuel you need to burn to fill it.
I mean, you did such a great job in your documentary where you showed the effects on real life people of what's happening, what some of these policies are doing to real life people in Australia. It'd be great to almost talk a bit about that for the people who have not watched your documentary. It'd be great for you to just to talk about the impact that you saw it directly happening to the people of Australia.
Yeah, well, we spoke to one woman who's within cannon shot of Parliament House, so you're not very far away at all. And although Canberra is a very wealthy community, she's a pensioner and she's bringing up, well, still supporting 3 children and a husband who's disabled. So she doesn't have much money. And her electricity bill essentially now wipes her out. Like when it comes in, it will wipe out all of the money that she's got. And anyone who's poor and anyone who's had to live from hand to mouth know that you can't put aside money for these things. Essentially, you have to deal with them when they become apparent. And we're seeing rising rates of energy poverty everywhere we see the same things done. It is the same in the UK. It is the same in Germany. It is the same in California. And when it comes to electricity prices, if having more wind and solar means that prices come down, well, South Australia in Australia has just about the largest penetration of wind and solar of anywhere on the planet, any particular jurisdiction. And it's got the highest electricity price in Australia. So this stuff is real world. This stuff is being demonstrated in real time. This is not a theory. But whenever you talk to anyone about, wind and solar, you get sold this theory, which is that in the modelling, when wind and solar is running, it is the cheapest form of power because the fuel source is free. That's true. But it's not running most of the time. And it needs to be supported by such a complex life support system and backed up by dispatchable fuel at some stage, that's usually a fossil fuel, that it actually becomes a ridiculously expensive system to run. And in the meantime, what we're doing is we're depowering our economies.
Chris, you've got such an extensive experience in journalism. You will have covered so much in Australia over the last 30 odd years. When did you see the shift with the net zero push, with the climate stuff across the West? I'm sure there would have been other areas that when you first got in journalism that you probably thought would be the bigger threats, the bigger worries. When did you start to see this? You mentioned 1992, but when did you really see the changes? When did you think this is actually a serious problem for Australia and the West?
Okay, that dawned on me over time, right? So, in fact, if it was 92, it might be 93. Whenever the Earth Summit was on in Rio, I interviewed the then Environment Minister, Ros Kelly, who was on her way there. It was the first time I had ever heard about global warming, and this was something that they were going to look into and something the world would have to do something about. Look, we had some experience with, the different problems that we could get with some chemicals in the atmosphere. So you might remember there was a Montreal Protocol where the sorts of things the products that we used in fridges were creating problems with the ozone layer, and because that was a specific kind of gas and there was a ready replacement, the world did a very good job in replacing that quite quickly. So I think people thought that this would be something that was similar. But the debate really sort of started to come to a head in Australia about 2006, 2007, when there was an election campaign on. The Labor Party made a big push on it. The Howard government was reasonably resistant to the idea of what was then a carbon tax. And the community was up for the conversation. And in Australia too, you'll find that people's concern about the climate follows the weather patterns. So at that stage in Australia, we'd had a drought since around about the year 2000. They called it the millennial drought. It ran for quite some time. So it became a really big issue. Then Kevin Rudd, our Prime Minister, was elected, essentially promising to do something about cutting carbon emissions. He called it the greatest moral challenge of all time. Roll forward 2 years, and when he's on the back foot against Tony Abbott and it had started raining again, he abandoned that policy on his carbon tax. So, again, politics is very malleable and it depends very much in Australia on what's happening at any given point in time. But we've been having what we've called the sort of the climate wars ever since 2006. It's been an on again, off again battle. But really, under Malcolm Turnbull and then Scott Morrison, we got to a point, and they're the two Conservative leaders, that they decided to sign up for net zero. And so both major parties now are on the same page, although there's a fairly significant group within inside our Conservatives who are now opposed to it as an idea. And look, mate, I think that what we're going to see is this thing's going to evaporate, right? Because you look at around the world, right? If a ton of carbon emitted anywhere is a problem everywhere, then of course the entire world has to act in unison. And think about what we've signed up for. In order to get to net zero, every country on Earth has to agree to cut their carbon emissions. They have to do it in unison. They have to do it over decades, and they have to not cheat. Now, what fool imagined that the world would ever do anything like that? That is just not realistic that we would. And so now what do we see? Well, China's never been signed up for net zero. Russia's not signed up for net zero. India certainly isn't signed up for net zero. And now the United States is not signed up for net zero. That's 60% of the world's emissions. We could shut down the UK and Australia tomorrow, and within a space of about 3 or 4 weeks, all of our carbon emissions would be taken up by China. So you have to start asking, what on earth are we doing? We are literally spending trillions of dollars trying to change the temperature of the planet, when what we should be doing is saying, okay, we've got an issue. It's not an existential issue. It's not. The world is not about to end. So what do? Well, we need to spend money on adapting. We could spend billions of dollars on that, as opposed to trillions of dollars on that, and not impoverish ourselves.
I think one of the things that is really fascinating, you've highlighted there, some of the fastest growing economies are the ones who are not abiding to the net zero policies and are just refusing to bow to them. And I think it's interesting because you talked about the weather patterns in Australia. I think in the UK, what I've been quite alarmed about is the lack of climate data over centuries. I think the generally we've got about 100 years of good climate data, but the planet is
Hmm.
billions of years old, so it's really hard to make such strong decisions that are essentially going to make the UK poorer and America poorer on data that's barely 100 years old. And I think that's really, I think the worrying sign. And some of these predictions that we've seen come out from our climate scientists in the UK and in the States have just been so wildly inaccurate. And I think that's been a massive part of it. In Australia, what's the general mood amongst the people? Are people very do they kind of subscribe to the net zero? Do they think this is an existential threat? Is that the general consensus amongst Australians?
Depends pretty much where you are. The closer you are to the city, the more likely you are to be concerned about it. The wealthier you are, the more concerned you are about it. The poorer you are, the more concerned you are just about cost of living. Our next election will really be about cost of living. And energy prices becomes a big part of it. You know, the Labor government here went to the last election promising that installing more wind and solar power would bring down the price of electricity, and they put a number on it. They said that by 2025, the price of electricity compared to 2022 would have gone down by $275. Well, since then, they have handed out government subsidies of $300 to every single Australian because the price of electricity has gone so high. And before the election, I'm sure they'll hand out another $300 because if they take away that particular payment at the moment, then people will be exposed to the actual cost of their electricity bills, and the government's standing will absolutely plummet. So yes, people are concerned. You tend to be more concerned if you're wealthier. One of the things I'd say to anybody, though, is if we do not keep our countries wealthy, use the resources that we have, poor countries do not look after the environment. And you're a well-travelled man, you would have seen this. You see the garbage in the streets of really poor countries compared to the way that rich countries tend now to be better at looking after the environment. So if you get poor, the first thing that's going to suffer will be the environment. I just think that I do feel that Trump's made a now substantial difference. The world now will have to wake up to what's going on. And look, I'll just give you one metric. One of the things that happened, I've been to Ukraine. I was there in 2023 to see what was happening with the war. And you're probably across this, but the big issue that the West have is that it couldn't get enough 155 millimeter shells to be able to supply Ukraine. Now, Russia uses 152 millimeter shells. They've essentially been using them since before the First World War. We've had the 155 millimeter shells, which are the NATO standard, since the First World War. As a piece of equipment, they're a pretty dumb piece of equipment. Now, you would think that's pretty easy to manufacture, but the US and Europe had to scrounge around the world to try and find those shells because we didn't have the manufacturing capacity to make them, where the Russians were making them at a much greater rate, and so were the North Koreans. Again, a country that is energy insecure has national security issues as well. Again, these two things follow each other. I encourage everyone, start putting energy at the center of every question about politics, and you'll begin to get some of the answers that we see at the moment. There's a reason Russia keeps attacking Ukraine's energy system, because the country won't function without it, right? So it is a real weakness that everyone knows that they can exploit. One thing you can say about Vladimir Putin, he absolutely understands the centrality of energy to an economy because Russia is such an energy-rich nation.
I think you could argue maybe only Trump understands that in the Western world, the importance of energy. What's the Trump what's the Australian reaction to Trump? In Britain, it's really mixed. So in Britain, I think they did as much as you can trust polling. They showed that he was overall not popular as a Donald Trump the person. His policies, however, were wildly popular. They were across the spectrum. Basically, essentially, if Britain didn't know it came from Donald Trump, they loved his policies. Him as a person wasn't as popular. What's he like in Australia? Is he liked or not revered? What's the general Trump feeling?
It'll be very similar to the UK, and I think you find this around the world, that outside the United States, Donald Trump doesn't play necessarily terribly well, although some of the policies that he's talking about do go around quite well with people. If you went to them and said, what do you think about an immigration policy when you're starting to forcefully remove people who are illegal immigrants, you get a fair few head nods in Australia, and I guarantee you'll get them in the UK, and you'd certainly get them in Germany. So, it is Donald Trump the man that some people find, unpalatable. But I was in the US in 2016 before Donald Trump was elected for the first time. And I was in Washington and thought, look, I can't stay here. I need to go somewhere where I meet people who are actually supporting Trump, because 96% of the population of Washington, D.C. votes Democrat, right? So I went down to West Virginia, to a little tiny town called Logan City in West Virginia, right on the border with Kentucky, and anyone who knows a bit about the United States might remember the Hatfields and the McCoys, this feud which ran for decades. Well, that was where it was played out. And I actually went looking for the grave of Ance Hatfield and found it on top of a hill. It was very difficult to find, and fluttering above it was a Confederate flag. So some things haven't really changed down in Logan County, but this was a coal-rich part of the world. And when you looked around the city of Logan, if you didn't eat McDonald's, there was nowhere else to eat in town. All the people there had a great many of the people there, I should say, had all of the things that you see that come with poverty: morbid obesity, there was drug dependency, there were burnt out houses, there were beggars on the streets of Logan City. This had once been a proud Democrat in the 1990s part of the United States. And in their lifetimes, they had seen their lifestyle completely destroyed. And what did they think destroyed it? The Washington Consensus. It was that both major parties had signed up to policies that they thought had destroyed their lifestyle. And what did they see in Donald Trump? An outsider. And what did they want? They didn't want someone to go to Washington and fix it. They wanted someone to go to Washington and burn it down. So everything that Trump did that annoyed the mainstream media and the mainstream of politics, both in the Republicans and in the Democrats, was, as far as those people were concerned, a sign that he was doing his job. So there is a visceral anger in parts of the United States against what they see as the lifestyle that's been delivered to them by the consensus that came out of Washington. And I put it to you that not all of the United States, but I don't think that Donald Trump can go hard enough when he goes at those institutions. And there's a deliberate plan. You can see they've put it in place, which is that they are in the process of deconstructing. Now, they may well go too far. They may well enforce a recession on the United States. This plan might not work, but there is method in what they're doing.
I feel very, optimistic with his new administration. I feel like it was almost, I don't want to say a good thing, but I think following the defeat in 2020, I think that the team he has around him seems so impressive for his administration. I want to touch on what you said then in 2016 with the Washington consensus and the general media element in 2016. I remember during that election, almost finding it impossible to get any information about Trump with regards to his policy, with regards to his plans. And the only way I could essentially get any information was to watch his rallies on YouTube. I've never seen anything like that across. Normally, US elections are covered so well in Britain. You learn about Mitt Romney and Obama. It's very well covered in the UK. I've always felt. I'm sure there's been some elements of bias, but it's not been too apparent. That election 2016 was so apparent, I think, for anyone in the UK, and it led to a point of having to watch a presidential candidate on YouTube, and I couldn't get anything on the main channels. You've obviously worked in media for a long time. Have you ever seen something like that occur before, where there has almost been this almost vilification of just one particular candidate and almost pure support for the other? Is that a new thing, or has that happened in the past?
No, I have seen it before, but on a very small scale. So roll back to the 1990s, and there was a candidate for the then Liberal Party called Pauline Hanson, who got pre-selected for a Liberal seat, and she said some things about Aboriginal Australians, which went down very badly, and she was punted out by the Liberal Party, and she eventually ended up running as an independent and winning. And the campaign against her, because she was saying things that were beyond the pale. And I don't necessarily agree with the things that she was saying, but I thought that she had a right to express them. And one of the things that she tapped into then was a feeling of discontent among who? Among blue-collar men, because Australia went through radical change in the 1980s, because we had a settlement in Australia where essentially we existed behind tariff walls. So there was a big manufacturing industry here. A lot of jobs were protected by the fact that you really couldn't compete The rest of the world couldn't compete because the tariff walls were so high. Well, it was a Labor government under Bob Hawke and the then Treasurer Paul Keating which began to dismantle that. And the argument that was always made was that, of course, these people, these blue-collar workers, if they lost a job, they'd find a job somewhere else. Well, that wasn't true. And it's not been true in so many of these industries. What we saw with a lot of those men is they never worked again. So they might get to their mid-40s or their early 50s and they were not retrained. They didn't get any more work. And guess what? They were really, really angry. And Pauline Hanson began to put her finger, and she wasn't particularly articulate. She's still in Australian politics. She's one of the enduring features of Australian politics now. Gets a small, maybe 6, maybe 7% of the vote at every election, more in some rural parts of Australia. But she appeals to a certain part of Australia because she speaks, although not articulately, in words that they understand and about sentiments that they actually feel. So I have seen it before. I saw it then. I was worried about it then. I was worried about the fact that we had decided as a media, and I was part of it, that these were opinions that could not be heard. And that was the same with Donald Trump. There are some things that must not be heard. He could be heard while he was considered to be a joke and wasn't going to win. When he became a threat, he couldn't be heard. And look, again, I do not agree with the way that Donald Trump conducts himself in public life. I would like to see a less coarse approach. I would like to see a better standard of debate across the Western world. But, he speaks in language that people can understand about things that they care about. And he seems to be trying to do things that will change their circumstances. So you can understand why he has a certain appeal. But what he's doing is shaking to its foundations a settlement which has benefited basically wealthy people, basically people who live in and around cities. If you're part of the international elite, you've got a passport, you can travel the world, you've got, you could change countries and feel reasonably happy about it. You don't feel necessarily connected to the country that you're in. That's not the case for people in Logan. They're not going anywhere. They are. The other thing too is they feel a deep sense of pride and patriotism about their country, which, as far as they're concerned, the leading elites in the world have essentially pissed all over. To use to be crude myself about it, but that's the way they feel. They feel that they are no longer allowed to be proud of their country. They must constantly look back in anger at what's happened in the past. In the UK, it goes back to colonialism. It goes back to the slave trade. And look, and here it goes back to the original sin of settlement. And it's true. The original sin of settlement in Australia is the dispossession of the Aboriginal people. That is something we have never settled. That is something we need to settle. It did enormous damage to that population. Like when you get disconnected, so disconnected from your culture that you're unable to speak the language that you came from. So you can't describe in the words that you used to describe your country, and you're not really part of the white society, then you're adrift in a community, and deep spiritual damage has been done, and it must be atoned for. And look, there are elements of the UK's history where there's deep damage that's been done. But you can't constantly look back in anger on the past because the world was a different place. And I think one of the things about our democracies is they're self-correcting, right? We recognise the fact that harm was done and we try to do better. But we shouldn't be ashamed of ourselves. At least we're making an effort. There are plenty of countries on earth that really don't give a rat's about what happened in the past, and they're going to do nasty things in the future.
What is the situation with the Aborigines in Australia now? Because every time I talk to Australians about it, it seems to be like a different opinion and a different belief in terms of what happened and what's going to happen. What's the situation now with the Aborigines in Australia, and do they make up still a significant portion of the country?
Well, about 1 or 2% of the population. In fact, that number is growing. So, look, there's a tragic story to be told about Australian Aboriginals, right? So once they were disconnected from their country, and disease was the biggest killer, although there was without a shadow of doubt massacres. Tasmania features in the halls of infamy in the demolition of the population there. Essentially, that was a genocide. There are people who have Aboriginal heritage who are still Tasmanian. You cannot say that there are no Aboriginal Australians in Tasmania because they're of mixed heritage. But that that the full-blood population there was killed before the turn of the 20th century. So, that is a great stain on Australia's past. There's no getting away from that. We should absolutely own up to our history and all the parts of it that are bad. But there are also really good parts of our history. And there were people who attempted to make a difference. And in fact, when Arthur Phillip came here under orders from the British government, it was to essentially make peace with the Aboriginal people, to try and make sure that they were looked after, to try and take into account that it was their land. But as so often is the case, the reach of the government inside Australia, once you had settlers here, couldn't touch them once they moved beyond the frontiers. And so basically it was the settlers who were responsible for committing most of the crimes that we saw. So yeah, that's all true, right? And that has to be atoned for. And I went to, outback New South Wales in the 1980s to a place called Wilkenia, a very long way inland, very big Aboriginal population. And the way that I saw people living there just was unbelievable to me. It was like I was seeing a documentary from somewhere in Africa. There were third world conditions. There were people living in humpies, there. And so, but governments have tried to do something about that. But I think that it misunderstands the soul deep damage that's been done. Like there's a spiritual damage that's been done that's very difficult to heal. And one of the mistakes that the left makes is they think they can fill that void with what people would call sit-down money, essentially that you get paid for doing nothing. There has to be a dignity with work. The problem with parts of regional Australia is it's very difficult to connect people to the real economy if you're living in a tiny little community. So, there are big problems with us dealing with that community. We need to own up to it. We need to try and do something about it as a country. It's a work which will see out the rest of my lifetime, I'm sure. But I'm not ashamed to be Australian. And neither, by the way, many of those Aboriginal people that I've met. There's a very noisy lobby that's extremely angry on their behalf that seems to hate Australia and everything that Australia stands for. But I don't think that they speak for everybody by any stretch of the imagination.
You say it there, you don't hate Australia. It seems, again, in the UK, there's so much anger from, if I'm honest, more white Brits who are just pushing a lot of anti-Britain agenda and almost this constant feeling of how bad and all the bad things the Britain have done. Is that similar in Australia, where you're seeing maybe a younger generation or a group of people who are really attacking, if you like, Australian beliefs and values, and the almost a constant needing to apologize for maybe your sin towards the Aborigines and Britain's sin with colonization? Is that constant feeling of that guilt? We're seeing it being played out publicly now with Sir Keir Starmer and a lot of the policies he's doing. There's talks of Britain now sending more reparations. There's talks about what's going on with the Chagos Islands, and it seems to actually be panned out, unfortunately, in politics. But in Australia, is that similar to the UK?
Yeah, the same class of people, right? The highly educated left. If I rewind to 1980 and to walking around the streets of Wilkenia, I was actually working with a group of Catholic nuns who had set up a mission there. In fact, believe it or not, they were New Zealand nuns. I can never work out why that was the case, but anyway, there were three of them there, two nurses and a teacher. And so they were dealing in kind of one kind of way of dealing with the problems of that community. And then I went to a more, if you like, modern, hip, left-wing community where I was welcomed into the house by the Indigenous people who were there. But the guy that ran that community was an anthropologist, a white anthropologist from the University of Sydney. And when he arrived, he abused me. When I told him where I was from, he abused me even more because, I was part of the white colonial oppressor class that was responsible for all of this. And I don't see how necessarily he's any different. He just has a different way of going about his business. It's certainly, one person trying to impose their ideas on other people. I don't understand why he thinks that he's any better than the others. He's just different. And so we see this around the Western world, right? So it is that the left of politics in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, all seem to be of one mind, which is that the sins of the past are so overwhelming that we have to shake off all aspects of it. But when they've ripped up the last flagstone of Western democracy, I wonder where they'll stand because they're not offering anything in its place. This is a project of deconstruction again. The mistake that these people make and why I believe their projects will fail in the long run is they see all the problems and don't see any solutions. They see They give us all the reasons to grieve, but none of the reasons to hope. And I think that's one of the things that we've got to try and recover in our youth, because I think it's probably the same in the UK. I'd say there's been 30 years worth of an education system here, which in Australia is dominated by the education unions, which are left-wing, which have been feeding our young people a steady diet of despair to the extent where they believe that they're going to be annihilated by climate change and that they carry such a great stain of sin that they have to be ashamed of their own countries. Is it any wonder that we are seeing such enormous levels of anxiety and despair in our young, and it's now supercharged by the arrival of social media? So I think it's a combination of these things which has led to the collapse of self-confidence in the West, and anyone who has any hope for the future has to try and re-enchant people with their past. And so this is the thing, like we're all, it is true of me and my family. My family is, part German, we're real bits. It's part German, part English, part Irish, part Scottish. Most of them arrived in the 1850s. The surname is German. The joke that I used to get in the playgrounds, when I was growing up, was I say, I had, someone who fought in the First World War, and they say, oh, which side? Funnily enough, and it was with the Australians, but when I went to the battlefields, I found the same name for one of my relatives on an Australian war grave, and then went to the German war graves and found the same surname and my wife's surname engraved on that grave. So not separated by very much, perhaps shooting each other during the course of that war. History is a complex thing. We have to work out what it is in what are now, whether people like it or not, multicultural, multi-faith societies. In the long run effect of multiculturalism, what are the things on which we can all agree and stand for before we fight about everything else?
You mentioned about the anxiety amongst young people in the UK. I don't know if this is the case in Australia, but in the UK, children at school are allowed to take days off for climate anxiety in primary school, and there's a whole talk about this now with the have like almost like counselling for what's going on in the climate. It's become a very popular thing, and I think even more worrying than that aspect is we're seeing in the UK there's an increase in the amount of people who are liking the idea of a dictator to come in and solve all these problems. I think a lot of it is I have some sympathy. I think the cost of living and sort of the difficulties in the housing market, and they probably think that the lives of their parents maybe will be better than theirs. And I think it all kind of comes down to what you said earlier in terms of hope. There is, I think, a real lack of hope amongst young people, and I think that's probably what's pushing some of these more radical ideas, such as a leaning towards a dictatorship, such as the idea of getting so anxious that you have to take a day off school because of the climate, which is, pretty absurd if you would have said 10, 20 years ago. And I'm sure it's maybe similar in Australia.
Oh, absolutely it is. I know speaking to young people, and my nieces included, my wife and I tried and failed to have kids. As I always say to her, it was God's way of telling us he wants us to be rich and travel a lot. But, I've got nieces and nephews, and they're ridiculously anxious about the climate. They genuinely believe it's an existential threat, that the world is about to end. And again, we have to have some honesty about the science that everyone talks about. So look at the science, and that's got to be the International Panel for Climate Change. Okay, its last major report on the physical science came out in 2021. And one of the things that we know about that is it said that in Australia, the incidence of tropical cyclones has fallen over the last 40 years. And in fact, on the paleoclimate records, it seems to be at its lowest in the last 550 to 1500 years. Now, there is some possibility, they say, in the modelling that these cyclones might become more intense. But last week in Australia, there was a tropical cyclone that went very, very far south. It went down to Brisbane and the north parts of New South Wales. That's coming a long way south in Australia. So in some ways, an unusual event, but it has happened before. There's records of it happening before. And what did the Prime Minister say? The science tells us that these will be more frequent and more intense. Science tells us nothing of the sort. And the worst distorters of the IPCC's reports on this science is the United Nations, and particularly the current head of that organisation. He went last year to the Solomon Islands. He made a video in front of a house where he said it was abandoned. He said it was abandoned because of rising sea levels in the Solomons. And a journalist from Sweden tracked down that family that came from that house. And why did they leave? Because of the 2009 tsunami. It had nothing at all to do with climate change or rising sea levels. The UN puts out a figure that says 1.7 million women and children die every year from climate-related events. That's 40 times higher than the number of women of people all told who die from climate-related or natural disasters. 40 times higher. When you look into that figure, what do you find? It was come from a World Health Organization report that was done a couple of years ago. What was it talking about? Well, indoor and outdoor air pollution and fetid water, the things that have been killing people in their droves for a very, very long time. The United Nations is spreading misinformation about climate change, using it to terrify people because they don't believe that unless there's an imminent threat, and that's why the weather's become such a big deal, if people don't see an imminent threat, then they won't do anything about it. One last thing on this, you'll constantly hear the figure that there is data that records that now there are 5 times more weather-related events of an extreme nature since 1970. The data set of that is held in Brussels. And what does it show? There's been 5 times more reporting since the 1970s. The person who keeps that data set has said you could make the argument that there has been no change. We're just making more reports about it because communications are better. And yet the United Nations uses that figure to claim that there's been more weather-related events. That's also not true.
Chris, do you think this is happening with the data on the climate deficits? Because I've seen a lot in the last maybe 5-10 years that has almost countered a lot of the stuff that the climate change team people have been saying. Because I've been reading so much where it says the number of deaths coming from natural disasters is decreasing pretty much every year. Do you think this is almost like a rebuttal to that they're saying no, actually it's not, or is that the idea?
I think there's deliberate misinformation on a massive and industrial scale. I think the United Nations is responsible for a lot of it, and it must be deliberate because these errors have been pointed out, and yet they persist in their reports. And I think that they believe that a noble lie is okay, that you can lie because this is a good cause, because there is evidence that the globe is warming. And look, I certainly see this when I go to Europe, right? Europe's summers now, they're pretty hot. They seem a lot hotter to me than they were when I was there in the 1990s. So I can see why Europe is concerned. And that's something that you're going to have to deal with. But it doesn't mean that it's an existential threat. If you look at the spread of humanity and what happened when we came out of Africa, as we got all the way to the North Pole and all the way into the deserts, and people exist in all of these environments, and they managed to do okay. So I think that what we need to do is to make a decision about whether we're going to continue to spend trillions of dollars of the world's treasure, mostly borrowed money, attempting to get the world to do something it's never going to do, which is to act in unison over decades without cheating, or we can spend billions of dollars trying to adapt to a changing climate and targeting money to those areas that's really needed. It seems to me like a no-brainer that that's what you do, that net zero is a folly, or as Chris Wright, the US Energy Secretary, said, a sinister target, because it is going to suck up an enormous amount of resources and have no effect.
What's next for you, Chris? You're talking a lot about energy. It's clear that you've got so much credentials in this now and so much. What do you envisage happening next? A, to Australia, but then B, to yourself. Are you going to continue to expose a lot of the energy kind of the energy lies that are being spread across the world? What's next for yourself?
Yeah, look, I think I essentially went into retirement. I worked for our public broadcaster, the ABC, for 19 years. I worked for a commercial broadcaster for 5 years. After that, I essentially retired a couple of years ago and thought that I would hang up my spurs. But unfortunately, I am so convinced that the policy response, and that's what I'm saying, not that there's not a problem, but the policy response is now so wrong and so skewed and doing so much damage to my country that I can't in good conscience sit back and do nothing, that I have to do what I can to raise my voice, to try and educate people as best I can about it. And look, The problem I've got is that, like, it's just me. The resources, and there are others, of course, doing it around the world, people like you, right? But the reason that we need to create networks and to try and raise some of these things is because the resources that have been arrayed against us are just remarkable. Like, I went to COP26 in Scotland. That is a giant trade fair where trillions of dollars of taxpayers' money has been taken from the poor and poured into the pockets of the rich. And those people are pouring a lot of that money into the pockets of groups that are pushing these kinds of agendas and are demonising fossil fuel. And as I say, again, the fossil fuels that they're actually going to need to support the wind and solar that they want, like gas, they're even demonising that and making it impossible to build the system that they want. You know, I cannot help but think that the back of all of this sort of stuff is an anti-human agenda, that people don't want people to have power. They don't want Africa to rise up out of poverty and have the same living standards that we have, because they see humanity as a pestilence on the face of the earth, that somehow we've defiled nature, and the best course for humans is to basically they open the door and see their way out and return the world to some kind of natural state that exists only in somebody's imagination. I can't help but thinking that they're deep down in this, there's a Malthusian project, an absolute hatred of humanity that dwells in the hearts of some of these activists.
I think it's really hard not to disagree with that, to be honest, especially when they know they are making their countries poorer, their people poorer. I think there is definitely, it feels like there's something sinister going on. Chris, it's been amazing to speak to you. I could do this with you for another couple of hours, but I'm conscious of timing. We have like a closing ritual that we do on this show every single time with every guest. And that is, what is an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular? So it can be something we discussed in this episode. It could be something completely trivial, but just in general, what's an unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular?
Well, look, one of the things I've been writing about since the 1990s was that if you're going to have a mass migration program, and Australia does, per head of population, one of the biggest in the world, you have to include social cohesion as part of that. That has to be one of the metrics that's included. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't come from all over the world. I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't have a multi-faith community. Like, you know, the fact that Christianity is, in some senses, dying is partly the fault of the Christians. In my own church, massive fault in the Catholic Church. You know, the sins of the fathers committed against the children are something that will take generations to atone, and the church deserves it. You know, I am still a cultural Catholic. I still care about my church, but I don't disagree with those people who are appalled by what they saw within the church. You know, that failing, you know, and when Christ said, you know, suffer the little children to come unto me, if the little children weren't safe, then that is a bone deep betrayal of the people that you claim to be looking after. So look, I get that. But I also understand that the cultural benefits that the Judeo-Christian system brought to the West are among its greatest strengths. People do not have to be Christian to come and live in the United Kingdom or in Australia. They should be welcome for everywhere, as long as they are welcoming of the culture into which they insert themselves and don't seek to undermine it. That's it. And I think there are some very basic things. It is, you have to agree in parliamentary democracy, in the rule of secular law, in equality as best we can imagine between the sexes, and opportunity for all people to succeed to the best of their abilities, because you'll never get equality among everyone. But there has to be a certain foundation stone that you sign up to, and understand that culturally, even though there's very few of them left, this society is Christian. And that's where all of its basic beliefs come from. And they're pretty good beliefs, right? Which is that do unto others as you have them do unto you. It is a pretty good rule of life.
No, agreed. Well, thank you for your time today, Chris. It's been amazing to learn what's going on in Australia, and in particular with the net zero stuff. And yeah, thank you for all your amazing work.
Mate, you take care, and thank you for yours, and hopefully see you again one day in the UK or here.
Definitely, definitely.